Hello, everyone. Welcome. Last time I was here, it was 2019, and we hadn't heard of COVID. So this is actually pretty exciting. We're here to hear from our finalists for the Grunin Prize. Everyone here came up with I would say, extraordinary a response to a particular problem using creative legal solutions. We have really a very interesting crop here with our finalists. So what we're going to do is let me introduce myself quickly, and then we'll just go down the line and have everyone introduce themselves and then tell us a little bit about their initiative. I am a journalist and a business writer, and one of the areas I write about is for-profit social entrepreneurship and impact investing. I write about it for Forbes and many other places. With that, let's get started. Why don't we start with you? Tell us who you are and tell us about your initiative.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank Grunin Center, Jay Grunin, for all the work, all the fantastic work in organizing this conference and bringing such a stellar group of participants together. I've learned so much from you all, and hopefully we can give back in return. So my name is Melissa Obici. I'm the president of Conduit Capital. I've been a lawyer for 30 years. Started out at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation doing emerging markets work, and then spent 20 years in alternative asset at big scale fund managers, and am now dedicated to bringing the experience that I've had back to my origins, which is really as an impact investor who wants to change the world. And what the problem that we've started with is one of our founders, when he retired, moved back to rural Vermont, and he saw the hollowing out of rural communities, the lack of quality jobs. Businesses were struggling to raise capital, and he wanted to do this on a national scale, not just local. And so this became a story of collaboration. And how do you bring together the networks, the knowledge, and the capital to address the needs of the 60 million people living in rural communities, which have been left behind? And so what's our thesis? Well, our thesis is to bring growth equity capital because we believe that entrepreneurial businesses can transform the communities in which they're located if they're able to scale. Many of them don't have access to capital that can help them do that. The second premise is that business success should benefit their communities, both locally and globally. And we can do that by supporting companies that promote employee and family wealth creation, that do no harm to the environment, and that also support themes of sustainable agriculture and food and the circular economy, which is where so much of the innovation that we see now in rural America. Well, we looked around, who are the stakeholders who could help us do this? We identified they're known as CDFIs, so the Community Development Finance Institutions, which are nonprofits, which are dedicated to bringing capital and financial services to communities who don't have enough of it, primarily in rural America. And we partnered with a group called the Community Reinvestment Fund, which has been lending into these markets for over 3 decades. So they were an ideal partner for us, Conduit Capital, who is a new for-profit impact manager. We've collected a group of individuals with very strong skill sets and expertise in the private market side. And so together, we decided to form a joint venture that would take on this challenge of bringing capital to rural markets. But we also needed capital. So we looked around for an anchor investor, and we identified the Farm Credit System. So many of you may have not heard of the Farm Credit System, but they are an organization of now 64 independent banks, which lend to rural communities. They support our farmers, but they're also interested in diversified rural economies. And we could access their capital by applying for a special license from the U.S. Department of Agriculture called a Rural Business Investment Company license. And with that, we were able to raise anchor capital from an aligned syndicate of banks who could then make an equity commitment because there may be debt capital available, but I think as most of us in the finance world know, you need that equity base to actually grow in a sustainable manner. And so we could do that with these banks with this license. And then the thesis is to raise money from corporates and foundations and philanthropies to round out that. I'll make two other points. The second thing we need to tackle, well, what are the legal structures to actually make all this happen? And we identified a joint venture platform, which would give the nonprofit and the for-profit equal governance. We both share the investment committee and the board. I sit on the board, and we designed compensation structures to attract the private equity talent, outside of our two organizations, so we could compensate them appropriately, and they would be in this separate organization. We jointly capitalized a manager. And then we formed a limited partnership vehicle so we could bring in the equity capital and raise money. And we designed a governance structure that aligned the needs of a nonprofit for preserving their mission orientation with the needs to raise capital from the for-profit world. So it had to be a vehicle that spoke to and appealed to multiple types of investors that were aligned in a mission, but who had different needs. And in some of the other panels, I heard people talk about speaking in 2 languages. Well, we had to, I think, speak in 3 languages, which is the nonprofit language, the private sector language, and then the government-supported banks of the farm credits. And then the last point I'll make is, well, how can we deliver on the promise? We've got the stakeholders, we've got the vehicle. What else do we need to actually make this a success? And we activated the networks of the key stakeholders. So we've got one CDFI, they're partnered with a network of CDFIs across the nation. So we could tap into these communities that we want to serve. Conduit Capital is affiliated with the Conduit Club, which is a 3,000 person strong community of people who are dedicated to social and environmental change. They could access their networks, mentor companies, serve on our boards. And we recruited a world-class advisory council. So again, people who might not have otherwise paid attention to a small $100 million strategy targeting rural America, but we could, with these partners, we could attract in, caliber people who could extend our reach. And the last thing that we brought, which I think applies for all of us in this community, is a lot of stick-to-itiveness. And it was just driven by the fundamental belief that as a society, we need to solve the issues that divide us and give everyone a chance to thrive.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. Yes.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. Some of you for the first time in person in many years. I'm glad that we're all back together. My name is Aaron Bork. I'm a partner at RPCK Rastegar Panchal here in NYC and the head of our fund formation practice. We have 2 projects that we submitted for the Grunin Prize that are being combined together into one submission. I was the head of one of the projects. My colleague Tom was the head of the other one. So I want to sort of begin by describing sort of the binding theme between these 2 projects and why we submitted them both, and then get into a bit of the details of the 2 projects. So these are both fund formations on which we were a sponsor council, and both of the funds have an impact carry structure built into them. The reason that we submitted these projects is because we believe that impact carry and impact linked compensation in general for fund general partners has the potential to create massive impact at scale. Because if you consider the amount of private capital that's invested through impact funds, it's a huge amount of capital. And if you can then align the incentive of the general partner to seek to maximize impact with those investments, then we think it has the potential to unlock a lot of impact. However, our observation, and I think the observation of others in the field, has been that so far impact carry has been a lot of smoke with not all that much fire. We have generally not seen that many funds with impact linked carry structures, and we don't feel that there's a very robust conversation going on around best practices as it relates to impact carry, and a very open conversation about some of the challenges inherent in building impact carry structures. So everybody kind of supports this concept in theory, as do we, but it's not a big mystery as to why there aren't more examples in the real world, because there's a lot of complexity involved in dealing in building these structures. And we feel that as lawyers, we have a lot of insight into what some of these complexities are, because we're the ones that are sort of on the front lines drafting deal documents. And we have learned through these projects and others that we've worked on that a lot of complexity is introduced when you start to make small changes in documents that have been developed for a different context, for a finance first context, and that are generally accepted in the marketplace. So for example, in fund LPAs, the terms around carried interest are well developed, well accepted across the marketplace, and you can take an LPA off of any shelf and use it, and it'll work for that particular context. But that hides the fact that there are actually a lot of interrelated and complex nuances in those agreements that work together that have been developed over time. And if you start to tinker with one or two things within that structure, it raises a whole host of questions that you have to then think through and consider the ripple effects of that. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do in the context of a fund formation where you have an impact fund manager. Oftentimes it's emerging managers. Oftentimes it's a small amount of capital that's being raised relative to funds in the non-impact context. And there are cost pressures and timing pressures. So there's a lot of pressure in that context to sort of revert to more tried and true or better understood structures, and not necessarily incur the additional cost or take the additional time necessary when you're trying to get to a closing to figure out all those details. So we've been lucky enough through our practice to have the opportunity to work on some impact carry structures. And we're very interested in sort of being agents in facilitating a conversation in the industry to sort of bring to the surface some of the complexities that maybe aren't talked about so much, and have a robust conversation to start to arrive at some best practices and common approaches that can reduce the cost of implementing impact carry structures so that it can achieve its promise. So that's sort of the overall context of why we felt that these projects were important and worth submitting. I'll give a little bit of detail about the project that I worked on, and then I'll turn it over to Tom to talk about his. So the fund that I worked on, and at the time I was actually at my former firm, Reed Smith, and I was sponsor counsel to Make Home. RPCK happened to be on the other side representing the anchor investor, Zoma Foundation. So that turned out to grease the wheels for my eventually joining RPCK, which was a nice side effect. But the fund is called the Outcomes Finance Accelerator Fund. Make Home Capital specializes in outcomes aligned financing investments, otherwise known as social impact bonds. And I think those are well understood, so I won't go too much into the detail of that. But the idea of the fund is to create a portfolio of investments, provide risk tolerant outcomes aligned financing to mission driven organizations in Colorado and surrounding states across a broad range of sectors, including education, environment, health, workforce, and economic development. Both of the parties involved in the first closing, meaning the sponsor and the anchor investor, were very interested in working together to build an impact carry structure into the fund, because they felt that it was important to create sort of a proof of concept, if you will, or an example of an impact linked carry structure to incentivize the general partner. So in the context of working on that project, I learned a few things about some key, what I think are some necessary components of a good impact linked carry structure that actually accomplishes the goals that it's set out to achieve. One of those things is that you need to have objective and verifiable impact metrics that can be measured during the course of the fund's life and are not subject to over engineering or discretion by the general partner. In this case, we were lucky in that the underlying investments, being outcomes aligned financing investments, already were structured in a manner that the financial return on the investments was dependent on achieving impact according to parameters that were determined at the investment level. And so there was kind of a marginal cost involved in developing impact targets at the fund level. They sort of had already been developed, and those targets were built in a manner that they could be independently verified. So to give you an example, one investment is called the Denver Para to Teacher Pipeline Project. And that project is designed to address the shortage of teachers in Denver public schools, and particularly diverse teachers in Denver public schools. And so the fund is making an investment in a pre-existing program that trains paraprofessionals, such as teaching assistants, to get certificates, formal teaching certificates. And the goal of the investment is to train an additional 200 teachers through this program at the University of Northern Colorado. So the impacts that Make Home identified as wanting to achieve with that investment was providing upward mobility for the paras that were getting trained as teachers, also to create good jobs for them, and to create a more diverse teaching staff in Denver public schools and better outcomes for students. And so they developed a few metrics to measure that, one of which is graduation from the program, which could be verified by University of Northern Colorado, and then hiring of the teachers and retention of the teachers over a 1 to 2 year period, which could be verified by the school districts. So the idea was to have metrics that were objectively verifiable, and that was then applied at the fund level as well. There was also a sense of collaboration between the general partner and Zoma as the lead LP, in that the general partner can propose outcome targets to the LPs, and the LPs can actually veto those targets by a majority and interest vote. And then there's a discussion around what impact targets to use for that particular investment. The one other thing I'll mention is one thing that we've observed in terms of market practice, and it's not that this is always the case, but we've tended to observe it, is that in developing an impact carry structure, folks tend to start with a traditional carried interest structure that they are already accustomed to and know well, which is the 20% of profits structure. And then iterate off of that in terms of creating the innovation of the impact carry. And what that often ends up resulting in is effectively a punishment to the manager for trying to achieve a double hurdle. So the impact manager is saying, not only will I provide financial value, but I'm also going to provide impact value. And they're holding themselves to those two different standards of performance. We think that the structures that we often see in the marketplace are a stick without a carrot, because really the fund manager is being punished for not achieving these two goals that it set out for, and is not necessarily receiving a reward for achieving on two different levels, as opposed to a non-impact manager, which is just trying to generate financial return. So we think that that's a matter of fundamental fairness. In this particular fund, the feature that I'll point out that relates to sort of fairness for the fund manager and also incentivizing the manager to achieve impact is we developed a two-tier American and European distribution waterfall. The parties felt that a European distribution waterfall is the market norm for a non-impact fund, and that would be fair from the financial carry perspective. In other words, the investors have to get all their money back from all investments before the GP can start earning carried interest. However, in terms of the impact carry, the parties felt that, for one, the carry is, or the outcome targets, I should say, are so unique across the investments. This fund is making investments in all kinds of different sectors. And so you can't necessarily analogize the impact from one investment to another. So the thought was, let's have an American distribution waterfall with respect to the impact carry to kind of acknowledge that each one is very different. But another effect of having an American distribution waterfall for the impact carry is that Make Home could do really well on the first investment, generate a ton of impact, and earn impact carry on that first investment. And even if all the other investments do poorly, and ultimately the investors don't get all of their money back, Make Home still gets that impact carry that they earned from the first investment. So as a matter of fairness, we felt that would incentivize Make Home to try to obviously generate good financial returns, but also maximize impact with respect to each investment, because that wouldn't subsequently be forfeited if investors didn't get all their money back on a whole fund basis. So that was a bit more detail than I planned to launch into. I hope I left a little bit of time for Tom. I apologize for that.
Hi, really good to see so many of you here. So my name is Tom Scriven. I'm the head of the Denver office for RPCK, and I have worked in the impact investing space for quite a while. Initially, I was general counsel and partner at Renew Capital investing in East Africa. And then in 2020, started working with RPCK to address more local impact investing solutions. And one of the One of those solutions is the Colorado Housing Accelerator Initiative, a client of ours that's managed by Weave Social Finance. So one of the things that I love about this client is they take a let's just get it done approach, and they've done that in a number of different ways, getting money out through a related entity to left behind workers in Colorado. And then now with this housing accelerator have focused on workforce housing and middle income housing, addressing the shortage in Colorado. There's about 127,000 units that need to be built for homes in Colorado. As a result of that shortfall, about 50% of Colorado residents in many cities throughout the state are not able to afford rents. That means they have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, which obviously is a significant issue and even a crisis. So CHI, the Colorado Housing Accelerator Initiative, set out to address this problem and did so through two funds, a debt fund and an equity fund. Well, they wanted to demonstrate to investors that they really were committed to affordability, because like so many other impact funds, there is this dynamic, this misalignment in terms of the commitment to impact and the commitment to financial returns. This is particularly evident in the affordable housing space. If you fund a below market rent, that means you're foregoing rent that could have been recovered, and investors are realizing a lower return. At the same time, the managers are incentivized to realize higher returns on account of their carried interest. It's just that simple. And so how do we address this? And let's figure out a way to do this in a fairly simple way so that we can explain this to LPs. It's already hard enough for first-time fund managers to raise funds, particularly for a below market fund. And so we need to keep this simple. And with those principles, we and the Weave team and the CHI team came up with a fairly simple structure that basically adjusts the GP's carried interest based on the average affordability of units funded by the fund. So there's a target for the fund. The fund's focused on middle income and workforce housing. So the affordability level is a little bit higher than you typically see with an affordable housing project. Here it's 80% of average area median income. And so if the fund invests in development projects that are restricted based on covenants in the financing documents to AMI below 80%, well, the average AMI across the fund is evaluated, and then the GP gets more carried. If the average AMI is above 80%, then they get less than 20%. So there's a carrot and a stick, that component that Aaron was talking about, for the fund manager to adjust carry based on something that the investors really care about. And in return, there's this other feature that the Weave team designed, which was this tenant equity vehicle. And so investors are also contributing part of their return above a certain target to a tenant equity vehicle, because obviously affordable housing is certainly something that we all need access to. But in addition, a lot of the residents need access to the tools to build wealth. And so financial literacy, access to some extra cash, bottom line, it's just about that cash that they need to begin putting a down payment for a home. So this tenant equity vehicle collects returns that investors otherwise would have realized from their investment on the fund, and then makes that available to tenants through this tenant equity vehicle that's administered in partnership with the community. So you have this other complementary activity that investors are supporting that also aligns incentives all towards both, ensuring that there are financial returns, and those financial returns then are complemented by the impact returns, with that tenant equity vehicle essentially supporting the investors' returns. Because as tenants have a little bit of extra cash and an incentive to stay in their units, because the longer that they're there, the longer they get access to the tenant equity vehicle funds, then the investors are benefiting because tenants are staying in these units longer and continuing to pay rent. So there's a lot of alignments that work together in a fairly simple way with this structure that we think, there are lessons learned for other impact fund managers that really want to demonstrate to investors, yes, I am committed to impact, and your lawyers will accept it because it's simple enough that, we can all get behind it without having to, pour over multiple pages of provisions and documents that we've never seen before. So I'll turn it over to Carolina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolina Serra. I'm a partner at Becar Varela, a law firm based in Argentina. And it's truly an honor to be here and to be sitting beside these titans. So our initiative in the end of the world consisted in achieving finances for NGOs through the capital markets. And for that, we paired up with Sumatoria in the issuance of their simplified negotiable obligations and social, green, and sustainable bonds. Just for a little bit of background, Asociación Sumatoria para una Nueva Economía, usually known as Sumatoria, is an Argentine no-profit civil association that aims to provide access to financial services and financial instruments to entrepreneurs, companies, or institutions that have a positive social and environmental impact. What they basically do is provide microcredits to those who don't have access to funding. So Sumatoria purpose was key to our project because they contributed to our multiplying factor, because we could not only provide access to NGOs, to capital markets, but then the funding went down to multiple entrepreneurs and devoted to impact. Also, for background, you have to know that non-profit associations play a very important role in Argentine society, because they add up efforts to government efforts in a context in which 43% of the population lives below the poverty line and 50% of children are in poverty. With that in mind, our project was led by Luciana De Neyri, and it started in April 2021 with the first viability analysis, and also engaging in conversations with the regulator, which is the National Securities Commission, for them to adapt the existing regulation in capital markets for civil associations to have access to it. So they finally amended the regulation for civil associations to be part of the capital markets. And at the same time, while we were engaging in discussions with the regulator, we started discussions with the banks that functioned or acted as guarantors, would act as guarantors of every issuance. We had to discuss with the markets in which the bonds were going to be traded. And at the same time, we helped and worked side by side with Sumatoria in adapting their structure to be able to not only comply with the capital markets regulation, but to also obtain the authorization from the National Securities Commission to issue the bonds. Today, Sumatoria issued 3 sustainable bonds, one of which has a gender perspective because the funds were devoted to projects related to women or led by women. With the funds obtained or raised with the 3 issuances, Sumatoria funded 33 projects within the city of Buenos Aires and in 10 different provinces of Argentina. Up to the date, the first issuance has already been fully paid up, and we are currently assessing a 4th issuance. The structure of the project was really straightforward. Investors would buy the bonds in the capital markets, and then Sumatoria would apply the funds to microcredits for social and environmental projects with positive impact. And then the banks would have a very important role because they guarantee the issuance. So in case Sumatoria defaults, they would pay the investors. And the flip coin of that is that they are banks, they always need something in return. So we created a system in which they had a counter guarantee for their securities. And in that regards, Sumatoria pledged the funds flow from the loans they provided to the entrepreneurs, but not only the funds that would come from the repayment of the loans issued with the issuance funds, but also with own funds. The project is rooted in transparency because all the projects in which Sumatoria invests are monitored, not only in the use of funds, but also in the impact they have. And honestly, we saw this initiative as a new channel of dialogue with very traditional stakeholders that would like to participate in the impact ecosystem, but probably didn't know how to plunge it. And with this, I'm also referring to very traditional banks and financial institutions. And also another thing that I think it was relevant from our project is that we could demonstrate that nonprofits and associations are a reliable subject of credit. And they play such an important role in our society that if we want to have an impact and make a change, we have to involve them. And this is why I think that the success of our project was very important. And we see that new projects are going to keep coming down the pipeline. And that's pretty much it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Curtis. I'm with the Whole Fast Collective, which is Patagonia's new nonprofit shareholder. I was formerly in the legal department of Patagonia as a deputy general counsel. And I'm going to be talking about our recent ownership change. And for me, this project started in my laundry room in April of 2021, about the same time your project started. And we were on lockdown. We were not back in the office yet. I had a call with our CEO, Ryan Gellert, and Hillary DeSucchi, our general counsel, and we were going to be talking about something, and I had my laundry dryer in the background, which they always made fun of me about. And when they came on and they said, Ivan wants to sell the company. And it was one of these moments where you're sort of like stunned and excited and scared and all of these different emotions. I wasn't surprised. I don't think they were either, because there had always been this question of what's going to happen to the company. Ivan was 84 years old. He wasn't, although he was living quieter during the pandemic, he was still living a pretty risky life and always out fishing and surfing and doing dangerous things whenever he could. And he was getting older, and life being what life is, we knew that there was going to be an event at some point soon. So we were always sort of thinking about it. And every once in a while, a question would come up of what are we going to do? And we would have to run down some research. But he was really serious about this time. He was frustrated. The climate crisis, the environmental crisis is getting worse. He wanted to do more. He didn't feel like he had the resources to do more. His friend who'd passed away, Doug Tompkins, had sold his stake in Esprit decades earlier and had encouraged him to do the same with the business with Patagonia. And he decided not to. He wanted to use it to inspire solutions, to inspire businesses to make different business choices. And he'd done that for years. And there had been this trajectory of decisions around becoming a benefit corporation, founding 1% for the planet, becoming certified as a B Corp. And so when he said, I want to sell the company, you knew there was something more to it. He was just sort of like hitting you with, I want an answer to this question. And so we began a really in-depth process with several phases. The first phase was really, what are you really trying to achieve here? Do you want a lot of money? Do you want a little bit of money over time? What about the business? Are you worried about what's going to happen to the business? And so we started this process with all the family members in the Patagonia board. And initially the list was really long. And then we distilled it down to 3 must-haves, which was, we wanted to release value now to fight the environmental crisis, agnostic to level of value. We wanted to protect the business durably forever going forward. That was table stakes. And then we wanted a decision to be made now. It had been an unanswered question for long enough. The employees wanted to know, our community members wanted to know, the family wanted to know. Every year that Ivan would show up on this Forbes billionaire list, he would get really frustrated, and he didn't want to have to deal with that anymore. And so with these criteria in mind, they were outcome agnostic. They just wanted an answer. And so as a lawyer, and Hillary as a lawyer, and Michael Paul Santos from Morrison Forster in the crowd here is sort of front row seat to all of this. It was like being a kid in a candy store. They wanted to know about any option, however wild, wherever in the world. Do we take Patagonia outside the US? What can we do to achieve these goals? And so we were laying up against all of the different permutations of different criteria, different structural outcomes that we could architect against these goals. And that was sort of the second phase of the project once we layered out what we were trying to achieve and grading it effectively against and which was going to perform the best. And we had a couple of structural advantages that we used to our benefit, which the first was that as a result of an estate plan that was in place in 2012, we already had voting and non-voting stock in our cap table. And Yvonne didn't want to sell the company. He just wanted resources. So it wasn't a question of he had a liquidity event that he was going to need some kind of charitable deduction to offset, which is a more typical outcome. And so he was willing to give it all away. And when you hear that in these conversations, you just sort of, by the time you hear it like 10 times and you really sort of test it, you're really sure. And we went through a really deliberative cycle where I always let them know, if you are going to give it all away, there's going to be moments, we can talk about it conceptually now, but we will get to a moment of no return. And I'll always let you know, before we get to that we're at that point. And so we were building a lot of trust with them going through this process. And we decided to protect the business, to meet that criteria, we landed on a perpetual purpose trust that we call the Patagonia Purpose Trust. And the purpose of that trust is to ensure that Patagonia remains faithful to its mission. That was capitalized with the taxable gift that Yvonne made and paid, which was a story for another time, but it was like the most, I'll just share now. There's a tax, and I sent this email to the founders and I said, this is what you're going to owe in this tax. And I just got a reply back. Okay. Like, it was very simple. They weren't going to change their mind. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. So between that and the freedom they gave us for structuring, it was just a really once in a lifetime opportunity. And so we used the Perpetual Purpose Trust with that gift to lock in all decision-making power. So it has control, but it really has no economic benefit from the business. So it has, from incentives and where its incentives are aligned, it has no reason to make a decision that's inconsistent with the principles of the business, because there's no individual that's going to personally benefit from that. If there are excess proceeds in the Purpose Trust, those will be given away to environmental nonprofits. The second tool that we used, because there was no liquidity event, we made a tax-free gift to a 501c4 of all of the non-voting stock, which represents 98% of the float. That's the Holdfast Collective. Dividends that the Holdfast Collective receives over time are going to be tax-free. So we doubled the financial firepower of the organization for the nonprofit work that it wants to do. And we call this model Going Purpose. It's intended, the way we think about it, Patagonia made the full commitment to Going Purpose, but there's a real spectrum. And we were really thoughtful of trying to create a model for other organizations to follow. And they could either go all the way that we did, or they can find some other point across that spectrum that meets their requirements, their facts and circumstances. Everyone's different. So that is our ownership model now.
Great. I'm happy to go, but do you want to do the person on the
What's
screen
that?
first? I'm happy to go now, or do you want to do Kovacs first?
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize he was up there. Yeah,
It's up there. Yes.
let's go up there.
Kovacs.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And actually very fascinating to hear from the other panelists. I'm sorry I'm not with you today. I do know Shamila, so she's kindly offered to allow me to go first. Thank you very much. Let me just give you a bit of context, because everyone knows about COVID-19 and people have probably heard about Kovacs, but they may not think about some of the context in the same way. So Gavi is a public-private partnership, and it is active in effectively setting up routine immunization childhood vaccine programs for low-income countries. It operates a pretty low-risk model alongside sort of key delivery partners, which is the WHO and UNICEF. And against that sort of context of normal operations, when COVID hit and people started to talk about, what would the response be, Gavi was sort of given a responsibility, which was slightly a daunting task from the WHO, of effectively taking on the vaccines delivery workstream for what was called Act A, and in that being the goal of getting fair and equitable access to vaccines across the globe. So it had quite a sort of an ambitious target. And the other piece of the context was this was at a time when there were no vaccines. No one knew if a single vaccine was going to be produced, if it was going to be successful, and if people will be able to produce it at scale to respond to the pandemic. And obviously, our minds were focused on low-income countries, but nonetheless, you'll see as I come on to this, it involved a response that actually tried to address both low-income and high-income countries. So we had three primary objectives. One was to incentivize manufacturers to expand vaccine production capacity. We were trying to kind of subvert the normal vaccine R&D production model, which actually has a very, very long timeline. And we were trying to accelerate that and get vaccines to be available at scale. And I'll come on to kind of some of the mechanisms in a little bit. Secondly, we were trying to ensure and guarantee fair and equitable access to COVID vaccines. This was partly in response to the H1N1 experience, and I've forgotten the year, but circa 10 years ago, when actually high-income countries hoarded vaccines and there was nothing left available for low-income countries. And then our third goal or objective was to develop a largest actively managed COVID vaccine sort of candidate portfolio, and that was in many ways as a support for some of the other objectives, because we were trying to bring in as many participants as possible and de-risk procurement for high-income countries and for ourselves on behalf of the donor-funded countries. So let me just give a kind of overview of how it works and the sort of the contractual frameworks. We had the higher income countries, which is high income plus upper middle income countries, and they joined the COVAX facility as self-financing participants. So they would be self-funding their purchases of vaccines. And then we had a group of lower income countries, which are traditionally supported low income countries plus low middle income countries, and there were 92 of those. And they would be funded by donor funds that we raised from our, traditional donors, as well as new and interested donors, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then joining those two things together, Gavi was effectively the administrator of the facility and responsible for securing the vaccines and tying things together through a relatively simple at one level, but rather complex contractual framework, because in some ways the ambition and the complexity was simply the scale and speed that we were working at, rather than necessarily any of the particular tools, although some of them were relatively innovative. So we had effectively commitments from self-financing countries that we used to bring in advanced funding. We used that advanced funding to sit alongside donor funding we raised to start making commitments to manufacturers. And it was that what we call sort of pull funding to manufacturers, rather than the push funding that traditional R&D supporters would follow, that actually was key to us trying to incentivize manufacturers to speed up their production and to produce at scale. And by doing so, bring in the more self-financing countries we could bring in. So effectively, the more vaccines we were purchasing, the greater our leverage in that negotiation with manufacturers, as well as, in theory, the better it would work, the larger it was. So then effectively, it then became a very straightforward procurement mechanism, only involving a number of different actors. So we would secure commitments with manufacturers, but actually in a similar to other offtake arrangements, the supply agreements themselves were entered into by UNICEF, the Pan American Health Organization, and the self-financing countries. And they could effectively draw down on the commitments we had secured with manufacturers. All of that involved, a huge amount of work. We effectively had raised through cash and contributions in kind, i.e. dose donations, around $15 billion worth of value, and we were spending that and securing the commitments. So this changed Gavi's model in the running of COVAX to something that had been very, very straightforward, low risk, and predictable, to something that was very, very fast, high risk, with a lot of financial and legal risk underpinning it all. Maybe I'm slightly conscious of time, but maybe just to sort of say some of the key challenges and pieces that we went through. One of the requirements from the big pharma companies was that the liability arrangements for low-income countries were resolved so that they could get access to doses. I suspect some of you are aware that all purchasers of COVID-19 vaccines effectively gave an indemnity for product liability risk to manufacturers in the purchase of those vaccines, and manufacturers insisted on it because of the scale and speed. And so for the low-income countries, partly as a transaction costs issue, but partly also to sort of get manufacturers comfortable, we negotiated a single form, what we called the model indemnity agreement, that all low-income 92 countries could sign up to with all manufacturers in our portfolio. And that standardization gave us the ability to roll out vaccines very quickly. But combined with that, manufacturers were often uncomfortable with I guess, the sovereign risk as well as the credit risk of countries. And so alongside it, we set up what we call the No-Fault Compensation Fund, which was effectively a no-fault compensation fund with no kind of litigious element required. So individuals would have access to compensation on effectively an administrative basis, provided they satisfied the requirements. And that de-risked the indemnity for manufacturers. And certainly for some of the manufacturers who insisted on that as a condition to delivery, it was a huge tool in improving the equitable nature of the access to vaccines. I wouldn't say they necessarily 100% achieved equitable access, but it certainly went some way towards it. The other big challenge was the whole dynamic of supply availability, and that has continued throughout we started this in mid-2020. Most of the work in terms of setting it up was done in late 2020 and early 2021. And some of the challenges we faced about that dynamic situation and supply are still playing out. We're still managing them. So today I received notification that J&J has had its FDA license for Covdin, the COVID-19 vaccine, revoked at their request. And so we are again working through a different challenge, but one that all based on that original context and premise, which was we had to commit to buy vaccines when we didn't know that they were going to be available, and when and how and in what volumes. I'll stop there. Hand over to Shamila.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shamila Ramasamy. I am truly honored to be here as well today. I'm a senior counsel at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I am a capital markets lawyer by training for about 10 years in London at the same law firm as Simon, actually. We overlapped for a bit. And I moved to the World Bank about 14 years ago to work on innovative financing transactions. Now, what does that mean, really? That's trying to apply structured finance and capital markets principles to multilateral financing, which doesn't necessarily sort of always translate, because the official sector financing world does not necessarily incorporate a lot of the structured finance and capital market structures that the private sector is most comfortable with. And so what I do at the World Bank is try to bring those two worlds together and try to sort of develop synergies between those two pools of capital, private sector and official sector capital. as a grand finalist today, we have the World Bank's Rhino bond, and I'll try to sort of distill three things, really. What the purpose of the bond was, what the bond structure is, and what is the innovation behind the bond and why it's important beyond rhinos. So this was a question posed to me, so that, raison d'etre of the bond is rhinos. Yesterday at the judging panel, the first question posed to me was, have you seen a rhino? So show of hands, who in this room has seen a rhino? Wow, okay, all right. So I couldn't raise my hand, I hadn't. So the real problem that we were trying to solve here, obviously, is that rhinos are an endangered species. The northern white male rhino, the last northern white male rhino died in 2019 or 2018, actually, end of 2018 in Kenya. The black rhino, which is what our World Bank Wildlife Conservation Bond is aimed at, really is very much an endangered species. In the 1970s in Africa, the numbers of black rhinos were about 60,000, but today we're just over 6,000. So what does that mean though? Why are we not sort of getting the right numbers? And that's because the staggering funding gap that is involved in conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems generally. The number is about 800 billion annually. And that's the estimated number. So clearly sort of just one pool of capital is not really sort of going to be able to address this staggering amount of funding gap for conservation efforts. And so that's what the Rhino Bond was sort of conceived for. It was conceived to try and address this huge funding gap for conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems. And we targeted the rhino because there was actually sort of a huge effort ongoing for a number of years. I mean, everybody was talking about how long all your initiatives took, and it's really sort of quite staggering if you think about the duration that it takes to bring something like this together. For about 5 years or 6 years, the Zoological Society of London were trying to sort of address where the funding gap was and how much it was going to cost to actually sort of bring those numbers back up to where they were in the 70s. And they only sort of approached, this team of researchers and experts only approached the private sector capital markets about 2 years before the bond was launched. And why is that? And it is actually sort of really to do with the fact that there is a real sort of gap in how traditional impact financing works that doesn't necessarily sort of get you to the point at which you need to attract institutional investors. And sort of that's where the innovation lies. But before I get to the innovation, first, what is the bond? The bond is effectively $150 million issuance price, nominal amount issued by the World Bank that goes towards funding the World Bank's regular sustainable development goals. Now, the innovation, though, in this bond is that the investors, institutional investors who are traditional investors of World Bank bonds, decided that they weren't going to receive coupon payments on these bonds. They said, don't pay us any interest. Please send it across to the parks in South Africa who are actually going to be working on rhino conservation. In return, the investors said, if your rhino conservation targets reach a particular level, pre-agreed based on the model that is very sort of complex, we will actually receive a success payment. So investors get a success payment at the end of this 5-year matured bond if wildlife conservation efforts in South Africa reach the intended targets. So that's the basic structure of the bond. But why is it really sort of innovative? And why is it sort of innovative beyond rhinos in South Africa? The innovation really in this particular context, in this rhino context, is the fact that institutional investors for the first time have decided to take pure outcome risks related to rhino conservation. And so it is really a watershed moment in conservation funding that institutional investors have taken that step and are willing to take the risk that is conservation efforts. Now, why were they willing to do that? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is it took us some time together with many partners. It really does take a village. It took us some time to get to the right metrics and the right sort of computations and modeling that creates the same impact as carbon credits or what you would see in a cat bond modeling structure. that didn't really exist for conservation efforts. So, because you need to sort of be able to equate the same outcome risks that are related there to abundance or population growth of rhinos, which is not a model that existed at the time. And so we had to sort of put together in this structure something that would make institutional investors comfortable to take that risk. Now, that's not the only thing, though, that made this innovative and made it possible for investors to actually cross the hurdle and accept that risk. It actually sort of has to do as well with the fact that it is structured as a financial security, a bond, and a bond issued by the World Bank, which is AAA rated, and hence principal protected. And that sort of gives additional security, if you like, to use a pun, to investors. But one of the things that's actually really critical, though, to be able to get to these institutional investors is to have a ticket size that's large enough. And that's where the innovation comes in drawing that level of investor interest into this type of outcome risk and model. So that's rhinos. And here's what we've been able to do with rhinos today. But the real innovation behind the structure is how we've been able to develop it and actually sort of use the principles and the technology that underpin this bond to apply it to other impact areas and sustainable development goals that the bank supports. So specifically, we were able to sort of utilize this structure to support water filtration systems in Vietnam. The same lead investor, Nuveen, who you'll hear speak on a panel tomorrow, who'll talk about why it was that they continue to be interested in these outcome-based bonds. And it's very much to do with the fact that they can actually sort of see the value of their sort of investment, but also get the right risk return on their investment. And that comes down to a lot of the structuring, but more importantly, building on this rhino bond model and taking it to a point in which in the Vietnam bond, for instance, we were able to access institutional investor capital without using any donor capital, which is what we needed in the rhino bond to actually generate that level of return to investors on a conservation success payment. On Vietnam, instead, we were able to do this using carbon credit receivables. So it's really sort of an innovation that goes beyond rhinos. And I'm so glad that there were a lot of hands just now in terms of how many of you have seen rhinos, but let's hope that this bond sort of gets us to the point that we all can say that we've seen rhinos up to the point in which they were at around in the 70s in Africa at 60,000. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. So unfortunately, I think we've reached our time limit. I had one or two other sort of overview questions that I was hoping to discuss, but I think we don't have time. Thank you, everyone. As I said in the beginning, these are really extraordinary examples. Truly, I have found that and I think they are proof of the fact that sort of legal creativity and lawyers are really the unsung heroes of impact investing and make it work. And thank you for coming.
Oh, very nice.
I just wonder if there's a way to use an incredible range. I mean, it's just structures in under lot.
It's like a very finite thing I was hoping for.
Yeah, I tried to miss it.
Oh, you did.